Hello, welcome to a mini lecture on the fairy tale. Before I start the lecture, I would like to invite you to think of as many fairy tales as possible that you have watched, read, or heard, the tales you have grown up with. Which one is your favorite and why? I will start the lecture with the definition of fairy tales. Strictly speaking, fairy tales should mean tales about or with fairy characters in them. However, the term has been popularly used to refer to tales without any fairy characters at all, such as Hansel and Gretel and Little Red Riding Hood. Now, you probably wonder why the term fairy tale has come to be broadly used to include tales with no fairy characters at all. The broad use of the term can be explained by looking at the history of how it was invented and eventually came to be adapted into English. The term fairy tale can be said to be a quite recent invention. By recently, I meant as recent as the 17th century. It was actually derived from a French phrase, Le Conte de Fées, which was the title of a book written by Countess d'Aulnoy, translated into Tales of the Fairies. As many scholars pinpointed, the translation later became a misnomer, in which, after its first introduction to England in the 19th century, later works with some resemblances to the Aulnoys that came to England, ultimately those from France or Germany, such as the works of the Grimm brothers and Charles Perrault, were also incorrectly translated as fairy tales. Many of these tales do not have any fairy characters in them, but they were still published in England under the category of the fairy tale. Realizing the misnomer, some other scholars have chosen to use alternative terms, such as magic tale or wonder tale instead. Jack Zipes, a leading scholar in fairy tale, introduced an alternative term of literary fairy tale. This term suggests that the invention of the term marked the literary transformation of formerly quote-unquote simple oral folk tale into more sophisticated literary fairy tale that follows literary convention and was published in print instead of orally transmitted. Zipf's suggestion on the transformation of oral tale into fairy tale shows a strong link between the two. Indeed, many scholars agree that fairy tales were rooted from folk tales or folklore tradition in general. They are considered the literary version of folk tales. Now, let's look at the historical background behind the transformation of folk tales as a type of folk narratives into fairy tales. There are at least four motifs that can be traced from the history of the genre in some European countries, ultimately Germany, France, Italy, and England. First is to strengthen a sense of nationalism through the establishment of national literature that is characterized by local values and to disseminate certain political values. Folklore, as the root of the fairy tale, has been circulating among members of communities since humans were able to express themselves to others. It belonged to the people with no individual ownership and political boundaries. However, as civilizations developed and national demarcations were created, folklore came to be regarded as one of the vital resources to create a sense of national identity. Germany, with the Grimm brothers' monumental endeavor of collecting and disseminating fairy tales, is often regarded to have set the ground for the use of folklore narratives and their transformation into literary fairy tales to, among others, create a sense of national literature and identity and serve the dissemination of the bourgeois values. Germany was not the only European country that turned to folk narratives for this mission of creating a national identity. Italy and France are two other popular examples of how fairy tales were manipulated to serve for national agenda. Bottiheimer, in 2004, asserts that the existence of a national repertoire of stories was required by 19th century nation builders. Their stories confirmed national identity by differing meaningfully from those of the nation next door. Second, folktales were rewritten and made into didactic fairy tales for children, to borrow Zipes' words, so that children would not be harmed by the violence, crudity, and fantastic exaggeration of the originals. Essentially, the contents and structure of these saccharine tales upheld the Victorian values of the status quo. Notice how Zipes called the fairy tales as saccharine tales. Third, folktales were also transformed into entertaining tales in printed form such as chapbooks and in plays, often trivial and with the main intention of making profits. According to Zipes, fairy tale plays became fashionable, especially fantasy plays for children, by the end of the 19th century. Finally, although fairy tales were manipulated by the ruling power, such as the bourgeois in the case of France and Germany, they also serve as a means for criticizing the current social conditions by artists and writers who were concerned with the social injustice around them. After learning about the definition and history of the fairy tale and how it was transformed from folktale, let's learn more about the relation between the two. Both fairy tales and folktales are part of the oral tradition of folklore, more specifically, folk narratives, which are divided into three important parts or genres, namely myths, legends, and folk tales. As the figure shows, many scholars such as Ashliman, from whom I adapted the classification, include fairy tales under the category of folk tales. Some other scholars prefer to treat the fairy tale as a separate genre of verbal folklore or folk narratives that is on the same class as myths, legends, and folk tales. So, instead of having three main forms, they argue that there are four main forms of folk narratives, adding fairy tales into the picture. Zipes, for instance, treats the fairy tale as a separate genre, though still strongly related to folk tales, and introduced the term literary fairy tale. Finally, there are scholars who treat the two, fairy tale and folk tale, as equal. That is, they use the two terms interchangeably. This divergence can be traced from the earliest attempts of classifying folk tales. In 1910, the Finnish scholar Antti Arn published Index of Folktale Types in German, which is a groundbreaking work that has informed many folklorists until today. The classification is based on the recurring motifs or plot patterns in folktales. In 1928 and 1961, American folklorist Steve Thompson translated and expanded Arndt's pioneering work in the types of the folktale, and the index is known as the AT or Arndt-Thompson Index. In 2004, German folklorist Hans-Georg Uther expanded the classification to the Arndt-Thompson-Uther classification system. He included a list of international folk tales in his book in response to his own critique of the lack of representativeness of the folk tales included in the previous classification. Indeed, Thompson admitted that the classification more appropriately applies for Europe, West Asia, and some other geographical locations, but it may not apply for some other regions such as North America, other parts of Asia, and Africa. The tale types in the classifications can be overlapping as well and are not meant to be used rigidly, meaning that one tale type may include other motifs and hence other types. This fluidity of tale types is also one of the criticisms against the classifications. Nevertheless, the classifications remain important work in folkloristic studies. As Dundes noted, they represent the keystones for the comparative method in folkloristics, a method which, despite postmodern naysayers and other prophets of gloom, continues to be the hallmark of international folkloristics. Let's look at the two most popular folktale classifications which are widely used to inform the studies of folk and fairy tales. That are the AT index and the ATU index. You will notice that fairy tale is not mentioned in both the AT index and its expansion, the ATU index, leading some scholars to think that folktales and fairy tales are basically the same thing. However, some other folklorists, such as Ashleyman, argues that tales of magic, which is included under the subcategory of ordinary folk tales in the AT index and a separate category in the ATU index, can serve as a synonym for fairy tales. This argument is supported by the many types of fairy tales found under the subcategory of tales of magic. We will now look specifically at the subcategories of tales of magic, which, to many folklorists, are equal to fairy tales. As you can see, tales of magic or fairy tales have 7 subcategories based on the motifs or plot patterns. It should be noted that the numbering of the tale types in both classifications remain the same, which is why, although Uther has expanded the index, the most popularly used classification remains the AT index. Now, can you think of which fairy tales that belong to each of the subcategories? Here are some examples of fairy tale titles based on the AT classification system. For fairy tales with supernatural adversaries as the motive, we have The Dragon Slayer, classified as AT 300, and Rapunzel, AT 310 as examples. For fairy tales with the motive of supernatural or enchanted wife or husband or other relatives, we have The Sleeping Beauty, classified as AT 410, and Beauty and the Beast, classified as AT 425C as examples. And then we have Rumpelstiltskin, classified as AT 500 as an example of a fairy tale with supernatural helper as the motive. And then we have Aladdin, classified as AT 561 as an example for fairy tales with the motive of magic items. Finally, we have Snow White, classified as AT 709 for fairy tales with the motive of other supernatural powers. You may note that some of the groupings are debatable, which, as I have mentioned earlier, has been the case with the classification. One of the reasons is because, as I also have mentioned earlier, fairy tales are rooted from folktales. They were adapted, written from the existing folktales. So you may find that the fairy tale The Three Little Pigs, for example, does not fit in any of the subcategories of the fairy tale or magic tales. Instead, it is included in the subcategory of animal tales. Another reason is because as a revolving genre, the fairy tale continues to transform. You may notice how Disney adaptation of Rapunzel, for example, will make you think that the tale can also be included under the subcategory of supernatural powers, because in the adaptation, Rapunzel's hair is depicted as having the supernatural power capable of maintaining the youth of her adversary and even healing the main character with her magic hair. So, can you find other examples of fairy tales based on the classification? As a genre, fairy tales continue to evolve. We still see the same motives of their transformation and dissemination today, although certainly some motives are more popular than the other, which we will discuss in the next section. Fairy tales, for instance, continue to be adapted into films and other communication technologies for the purpose of profit making. Fairy tales have also continued to be rewritten for certain social and political purposes. Thus, we've probably heard of such terms as rewritten, fractured, revised, or revisioned fairy tales. They all essentially refer to the same thing, namely revisiting the old fairy tales for new or current social and political purposes. That is why Bobby contends that many of today's fairy tales reflect the social, political, and cultural climate of their age. One of the strongest motives for the transformation of today's fairy tales is concerned with the issue of gender equality. To start with, many fairy tale scholars are concerned with the absence of women's voices in fairy tales. In fact, the surviving classical fairy tales that remain popular until today are those collected and written by men. Meanwhile, as Joyce explains, especially in France in the 16th and 17th centuries, many female writers known as countesses wrote and rewrote fairy tales with a style that distinguished them from the male fairy tale writers. However, the moralizing of fairy tales and basically all literature for children by the end of the 18th and 19th centuries marked the end for the female writing. On the other hand, the fairy tales collected and written by male writers could stand the test of time and continue to have great influence on contemporary literary and cultural productions. These fairy tales, as Zipes suggests, have also been canonized. Women's voice also becomes the concern because many collectors of fairy tales, ultimately the brothers Grimm, claimed that they collected the fairy tales from female peasants and working women from the middle-class family. However, the voices of these women seem to be absent in the stories that they recounted. As Bobby notes, the classic fairy tales are almost always narrated by an omniscient point of view, flat in tone, and deductive in the most straightforward way. In addition, the fairy tales are crowded with characters that are at the extreme ends of the society, either really poor or really rich, a king or a peasant, etc. This unappealing character of fairy tales is most likely attributed to the rigorous editing process undertaken by the collectors of the tales. Finally, Haas has noted, feminist criticism on fairy tales in the 1970s was primarily concerned with the genre's representation of females and the effects of these representations on the gender identity and behavior of children in particular. In responding to the dominantly patriarchal and gender-biased fairy tales, many feminist writers endeavor to subvert the fairy tales. The subversion is based on a belief that feminist fairy tales play an important role in children's education of non-sexist role divisions and socialization. It has been widely accepted that fairy tales have such vital influence in shaping children's beliefs and values And reading feminist fairy tales to them can help children see alternative values in terms of gender roles compared to the traditional values embedded in the traditional fairy tales. Tatar reveals the ways people have mobilized fairy tales to help form new social roles and identities, which also apply for the feminist fairy tales, including recovering and critiquing the classic canon, reviving heretical texts, stories repressed and suppressed from cultural memory, and the formation of a new canon, and rewriting the old tales or creating new ones based on the existing tales. Among feminist writers, the rewriting of the old fairy tale seems to be preferred to subvert the patriarchal values. The great number of rewritten fairy tales by feminist and postmodern writers has prompted Jewson to call this era the International Fairy Tale Renaissance that began in the 1960s, initiated by postmodern or post-structuralist fairy tales. Although fairy tales have been popularly rewritten by feminist writers with their feminist agenda of promoting gender equality, the tales have the same potential to be transformed or rewritten for other political and social purposes. Quite recently, the popular fairy tale The Three Little Pigs has been rewritten to raise an awareness of the global climate change by the 24th Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, or COP24, in collaboration with the Polish Ministry of the Environment and State Forest Poland. In this revisioned fairy tale, the wolf as the enemy in the original story is replaced with climate change, and so the three little pigs had to try their hardest to build a house that can protect them from the climate change. Can you think of other examples or come up with ideas on your own transformed fairy tales? For more references on fairy tales, please consult these articles and books. See you in the next mini lecture.